Krull wasn't just another fantasy. It was Star Wars by way of dark myth. But behind the swords and the sorcery, it was ruin disguised as destiny. A princess split between two women, a legacy buried in a forgotten role, and toys that outlived the film itself. These are 20 weird facts about Krull, and hidden inside the fire and the fortress, a fantasy forged in the fire of Star Wars fever. The box office buried it, but the legend refused to die. Number 1. In 1977, Star Wars didn't just change Hollywood, it infected every studio with galaxy-sized ambition. Columbia Pictures, eager for their own space saga, looked across the Atlantic and made a bold bet. They would craft a movie that fused Arthurian legend with cosmic spectacle. Instead of smugglers and Jedi, it would be kings, castles, and a mystical weapon shaped like no sword anyone had ever seen. The gamble? A staggering $30 million budget, one of the most expensive fantasy projects of its time. But this wasn't just Hollywood excess. Columbia wanted to prove they could build a new mythology from scratch, one that blended the ancient with the futuristic. Spaceships collided with medieval castles, outlaws rode like knights across alien landscapes, and a magical five-bladed star, the glaive, was meant to stand tall alongside the lightsaber in pop culture. The ambition was sky high, but the risks were deadly. For every Star Wars, there were a dozen forgotten imitators, and Columbia was betting that Krull would be the chosen one. Number 2. For years, fans whispered that Krull had started life as a Dungeons & Dragons movie. The rumor made sense. Everything about the film felt like it had been lifted from a campaign book. Dungeons, monsters, bandits, and a magical weapon straight out of a dice roll. The truth was murkier. Columbia Pictures had briefly explored a deal for the official rights, but it fizzled before cameras ever rolled. What stuck was the fantasy DNA. Producer Alan Marshall and the writers leaned hard into pulp tropes. A questing party, a fortress dungeon, even a mystical MacGuffin that might as well have been a legendary artifact card. The supposed working title, Dragons of Krull, only added fuel to the myth, convincing fans for decades that the movie was secretly the first D&D adaptation. Number 3. Before Krull, director Peter Yates wasn't known for dragons, castles, or laser beams. He was the man behind Bullet, the Steve McQueen crime thriller famous for one of cinema's greatest car chases, and Breaking Away, a tender coming-of-age story that earned him an Oscar nomination. His reputation was grounded in grit and realism, fast cars, quiet emotion, and stories set firmly on Earth. When Columbia approached him with a sprawling sci-fi fantasy script, Hollywood was stunned. Why would a master of asphalt and alleys gamble on a world of alien fortresses and shape-shifting monsters? Yates himself gave the answer. He wanted to play with imagination instead of asphalt. At Pinewood Studios, he stepped onto cavernous sound stages filled with foam mountains, glowing swamps, and a fortress built like a cathedral. For a man used to chasing realism, it was like stepping into another dimension. He directed Liam Neeson, Robbie Coltrane, and Ken Marshall through sword fights and Cyclops prophecies, all while balancing the demands of visual effects and old-school stunt work. The choice baffled critics but thrilled Yates, who saw Krull not as a detour but as liberation, proof that even a director of cold, hard crime could dream of stars and sorcery. Number 4. The Swamp of Death might have sounded like pulp fantasy on the page, but on set it was all too real. Built on a waterlogged soundstage, the swamp was unstable from the start. Mud sucked at boots, planks shifted underfoot, and electrical rigs constantly shorted out. Actors slipped, crew members tumbled, and more than once the entire day's shooting was nearly scrapped when the water threatened to swamp the equipment. Ken Marshall, who played Colwyn, later admitted that slogging through the muck was harder than any sword fight he faced. What audiences saw was a misty fantasy swamp full of danger. What the cast endured was exhaustion, frustration, and the very real fear that one wrong step could twist an ankle or worse. Behind the camera, it was less about battling mythical creatures than surviving the set itself. In the end, the swamp didn't just test the Marshalls on screen, it tested everyone who dared to wade into it. Number 5. Krull didn't just film at Pinewood Studios, it swallowed it whole. With 23 massive sets spread across 10 sound stages, the production was one of the largest Pinewood had ever hosted, rivaling the Bond films shooting next door. Every corner of the lot buzzed with activity. One stage filled with swamp water, another dominated by the Black Fortress miniatures, others housing forests, caves, and alien landscapes. The sheer size created chaos. Crews sprinted between buildings, carpenters worked around the clock, and production schedules constantly overlapped. At times, Yates had to stage scenes wherever a set was free, like a general moving troops across a battlefield. For the actors, it meant stepping from medieval castles into alien corridors in the same day. Pinewood had hosted epics before, but Krull's overload pushed the studio to its limits, a cosmic fantasy that briefly turned one of Britain's most famous lots into its own sprawling universe. Number 6. Princess Lysa may have been the heart of Krull, but the actress who appeared on screen wasn't entirely entirely her own creation. Lisette Anthony was just 20 years old when she landed the role, chosen for her ethereal look and regal presence. She spent long days in elaborate gowns, filmed romantic scenes with Ken Marshall, and carried much of the film's emotional weight. But when producers reviewed her performance, they decided her naturally soft, British voice didn't fit the tone they wanted. Without telling her until later, they hired American actress Lindsay Krause to dub every single line of dialogue. The result was a strange hybrid, a princess built from two women. On screen, Anthony's expressions and movements gave Liz a form, but Krause's sharper, more commanding delivery gave her voice. Anthony later admitted she was devastated, calling it humiliating to have her performance altered without her input. For audiences, though, the blend went unnoticed. Lissa became the image of purity and power at the center of the quest. Yet behind the camera, she was also a reminder of how Hollywood often pieced together characters from fragments, deciding what a heroine should sound like, even if it meant silencing the actress who brought her to life. Number 7. Long before Taken turned him into Hollywood's most unlikely action hero, Liam Neeson was just another hungry young actor looking for work. In Krull, he strapped on leather armor to play Keegan, one of the ragtag bandits who joins Colwyn's quest. He wasn't the lead or even close. His role was small, a roguish outlaw with a sly grin and a handful of lines. Yet even in those brief moments, there were flashes of the commanding screen presence that would one day make him a star. At the time, hardly anyone noticed. Neeson's career was still a patchwork of small parts, from a night in Excalibur to TV guest spots in the UK. On Krull, he was just another face in a large ensemble, lost among shifting sets and special effects. But when you look back now, knowing what came later, it feels uncanny. In the middle of a cult flop that most critics wrote off, there's Liam Neeson, years before Schindler's List, before Star Wars, before the phone calls about having a particular set of skills. Krull didn't make him a star, but it gave him one of his first brushes with fantasy, proof that even legends begin in the shadows of forgotten worlds. Number 8. Before he became Hagrid, the gentle giant who stole hearts in Harry Potter, Robbie Coltrane was still searching for his place in cinema. In Krull, he appeared as Rel, another member of Colwyn's outlaw band. On set, Coltrane wasn't treated like a future star. His lines were minimal, his screen time scattered, and to top it off, producers decided his thick Scottish accent didn't quite fit the film's tone. They brought in another actor to dub over his voice entirely, erasing one of the qualities that would later define him. At the time, Coltrane was known more for comedy and TV appearances than fantasy epics. Yet looking back, Krull feels like the first stepping stone toward the kind of roles he would later embody, larger-than-life figures with warmth hidden beneath gruff exteriors. Even if the voice audiences heard wasn't his, the physicality was all Coltrane. The broad shoulders, the expressive eyes, the sense that this outlaw carried more depth than the script allowed. Krull may not have made him famous, but it quietly set him on a path that would lead, 2 decades later, to the most beloved giant in fantasy cinema. Number 9. Tucked among the bandits who joined Colwyn's quest was Alan Armstrong, a face most audiences in 1983 barely noticed. At the time, Armstrong was a hardworking British stage actor, bouncing between television roles and supporting parts in film. In Krull, he played Torquil, one of the outlaws who reluctantly turns hero. His role wasn't flashy, but Armstrong brought a grit and weariness that grounded the fantasy. He looked like a man who had survived real battles long before the cameras rolled. For Armstrong, Krull was just another job in a long line of work, but history turned it into a snapshot of an actor on the verge of a remarkable career. Over the following decades, he would become a familiar presence in everything from Braveheart to The Mummy Returns, from Van Helsing to Les Miserables on stage. Watching Krull now feels like flipping through a time capsule. Hidden in the bandit's armor is a performer who would one day become one of Britain's most respected character actors. In a film remembered for its weapon and its failure, Armstrong's presence is its quietest legacy, proof that sometimes the true treasure in a forgotten fantasy isn't the glaive or the fortress, but the future legends hiding in plain sight. Number 10. Krull was built around its young hero Colwyn, a role that could have launched a star. At first, producers courted established names, hoping to anchor their $30 million gamble with a familiar face. But the bigger actors passed, wary of a risky fantasy project already ballooning in scope. The part finally went to Ken Marshall, a stage-trained actor with only a handful of credits. For Columbia Pictures, it was a bold play, maybe too bold. Marshall had the look, but not the box office pull. Instead of catapulting him to stardom, the film's flop left him adrift. He later found steady work in television, most notably in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but never became the leading man Hollywood imagined. Watching Krull today feels like a glimpse of a road not taken, a fantasy epic where a different Colwyn might have changed the movie's fate. Number 11. Krull promised castles, monsters, and cosmic battles, but audiences walked away remembering one thing above all: the glaive. A 5-bladed throwing star that shimmered like a crown of fire. It became the film's instant icon. Posters, trailers, and merchandise plastered the weapon everywhere, turning it into a fantasy Excalibur. The irony? In the movie, Colwyn barely uses it. After endless buildup, the glaive flashes to life only a handful of times, leaving fans craving more. Critics mocked the underuse, but the imagery was too strong to fade. The glaive became a cult symbol, tattooed on fans, reimagined in video games, and still referenced in fantasy circles decades later. Krull may have stumbled at the box office, but its star weapon carved a legend of its own, outlasting the very story it was created for. Number 12. The Black Fortress was no ordinary movie set. It was a nightmare cathedral built for the screen. Production designers shaped it less like a spaceship and more like a Gothic church, with arches, spires, and shadowed cruciform hallways that felt lifted from Notre Dame. And none of it was digital. Massive miniatures stretched across sound stages, matte paintings extended impossible walls, and optical effects stitched the illusions together. Every shifting chamber and collapsing wall was crafted by hand, filmed with painstaking precision. The scale was so convincing that audiences swore they were staring into a living fortress, not painted glass and plaster. Looking back, it stands as one of the last great monuments of practical movie magic, a cathedral in space, rising just before the digital age took over. Number 13. The beast was meant to terrify, but the creature suit turned out to be its own worst enemy. Built from layers of heavy rubber and foam, it barely flexed, and every time the actor tried to lunge or swipe, the seams threatened to split. Up close, it looked awkward, more theme park costume than galactic nightmare. Director Peter Yates had to improvise. He kept the monster cloaked in shadow, showing only fragments. A claw here, a glowing eye there, a silhouette writhing behind smoke. The strategy worked. Instead of revealing a lumbering rubber suit, he let imagination do the work. For kids in 1983, those shadowy glimpses were more frightening than any clear reveal. Ironically, the beast became scarier because it was broken, a movie monster that owed its menace to limitations, not perfection. Number 14. By 1983, James Horner was still climbing Hollywood's ladder, but his talent was undeniable. Fresh off Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Something Wicked This Way Comes, he stepped into Krull with the hunger of a young composer eager to prove himself. What he delivered was a thunderous, sweeping score that dwarfed the movie itself. Strings soared like prophecy, brass clashed like swords, and choral swells gave even the campiest scenes a weight they hadn't earned. Many critics later admitted that Horner's music felt like it belonged to a masterpiece the film never became, a soundtrack that conjured Tolkien-sized gravitas even as rubber monsters stumbled across the screen. For fans, it was a revelation. Krull might have faltered at the box office, but its music lived on, reused in trailers, performed in concert halls, and studied by young musicians. Decades later, listeners still rank it among Horner's best early works, a rising star announcing himself with symphonic fury. Number 15. When Krull thundered into theaters in 1983, critics mocked the story, audiences stayed home, and Columbia Pictures watched its dream of a British Star Wars sink beneath a wave of bigger blockbusters. Yet amid the wreckage, one piece of the film stood tall: James Horner's score. It was so powerful, so sweeping, that it earned the film its only brush with prestige, a Saturn Award nomination for Best Music. Krull didn't win, but that nod became the seed of its afterlife. As VHS and cable rescued the movie from obscurity, Horner's music found its own immortality, released on LPs, CDs, and even reissued in lavish collector's editions decades later. Fans who barely remembered the movie still remembered the sound, the galloping themes, the soaring strings, the weight of an epic trapped inside a flawed fantasy. In the end, Krull's legacy wasn't its glaive or its box office. It was Horner's music, echoing long after the film's failure, proof that sometimes the score outlives the story. Number 16. On paper, Krull looked unstoppable. A $30 million budget, a British crew at the height of Pinewood's power, and Columbia Pictures selling it as the next great fantasy epic. But when it opened in July 1983, the dream collapsed almost overnight. The timing couldn't have been worse. Superman 3 was already flying high, Jaws 3D promised gimmick thrills, and James Bond's Octopussy was still filling theaters. Against such giants, Krull barely stood a chance. Its confusing mix of swords, spaceships, and a hero few had heard of left audiences cold. The movie crawled to just $16 million worldwide, barely half its budget, and nowhere near the merchandising hopes Columbia had built around toys, comics, and arcade games. The failure stung so badly that the studio quietly buried talk of sequels, despite the open-ended finale teasing more adventures. For Columbia, Krull wasn't just a flop. It was a costly reminder that you can't force a franchise into existence, no matter how many stages you build or how many blades you put on your hero's weapon. Number 17. Columbia Pictures may have lost its gamble at the box office, but they weren't shy about betting big on Krull as a brand. Before the film even opened, they treated it like the next Star Wars, pushing tie-ins across every corner of pop culture. culture. Marvel Comics rushed out a 2-issue adaptation. Atari built a Krull arcade game alongside a 2600 cartridge, and toy companies slapped the 5-bladed glaive onto posters, lunchboxes, and even Halloween costumes. The irony? Most kids first discovered Krull not in theaters, but at the arcade or flipping through a comic. While the movie fizzled, its merchandising kept glowing in the background, a strange echo of a blockbuster that never was. For years, the glaive lived on as a pop culture relic, turning up on t-shirts and tattoos long after the film's sets had been struck. In the end, Columbia's push outlasted their product. The movie may have bombed, but its souvenirs became the myth, proof that sometimes the marketing has a longer life than the movie itself. Number 18. If Krull died in theaters, it was VHS that brought it back to life. In the mid-80s, video rental stores were exploding across America, and Columbia quietly shipped Krull onto their shelves. Kids who never saw it during its doomed summer run suddenly discovered it on a Friday night trip to Blockbuster, sandwiched between Star Wars tapes and fantasy cartoons. The movie that once played to half-empty auditoriums now flickered in basements, sleepovers, and dorm lounges, where its mix of monsters, glowing weapons, and cosmic castles felt less like a flop and more like a secret treasure. Cable TV added fuel, airing it endlessly on late-night slots until the imagery of the glaive and the Sleestaks-like slayers burned into young imaginations. Slowly, Krull morphed from that movie nobody saw into a cult classic that everybody claimed to remember. On VHS, the film didn't just survive, it built the very fandom that still carries it today. Number 19. When Krull hit theaters in 1983, critics carved it to pieces. Roger Ebert dismissed it as foolish and numbing, while others scoffed at its clunky dialogue, stiff acting, and muddled mix of sci-fi and fantasy. Reviewers expected another Star Wars, and instead saw what they thought was a lumbering pretender. But while the press piled on, fan magazines and early sci-fi zines told a different story. Writers praised its sheer ambition, a world where starships looked like Gothic cathedrals, and a weapon like the glaive felt ripped straight out of legend. Over time, defenders reframed the movie as so bad it's good, or more generously, a flawed masterpiece with a heart. By the 90s, conventions were full of people who discovered Krull on VHS and argued it deserved respect. What began as mockery transformed into a badge of honor, proof that sometimes a critical disaster can still spark devotion in the very audience it was meant for. Number 20. For a movie buried at the box office, Krull has proven strangely immortal. Decades after its 1983 release, it still shows up at convention panels, where fans debate the film's flaws with the same passion they praise its ambition. Prop replicas of the glaive sell out instantly, prized like relics of a world that only existed for 2 hours on screen. Cosplayers keep the Sleestaks cousins, the Slayers, alive with armor builds, while online forums buzz with theories about the movie that was almost a Dungeons & Dragons adaptation. Even video games have tipped their hat. World of Warcraft named a zone Marshall's Refuge, and borrowed glowing crystal aesthetics straight from the film. In an era where true cult classics are rare, Krull has carved out a unique niche. It isn't remembered as a flawless epic, but as a strange, ambitious failure that refused to vanish. A cinematic underdog still clinging to life through the loyalty of its fans. Bonus fact: over time, Krull has earned a crown no studio expected, the title of King of Failed Epics. When it opened in 1983, it was mocked, forgotten, and dismissed as Columbia's costly mistake. But slowly, through VHS, cable reruns, and the persistence of fantasy fans, it transformed into something rarer, a beloved relic of ambition gone wrong. Writers who grew up in the 80s cite it as a spark for their own stories. Game designers borrowed its imagery, from glowing fortresses to the unforgettable 5-bladed glaive. Even today, replicas of that weapon circulate at fan expos, often more recognized than the film itself. Ironically, the movie that bankrupted Columbia's dreams ended up shaping a generation's imagination. In a genre littered with forgettable flops, Krull became the cult crown jewel, proof that failure on paper can still glitter like legend when it survives in the hearts of fans. Krull was born from Star Wars envy, crushed by bigger franchises, and mocked into obscurity. But in the shadows, it gathered power. VHS rewinds, fan defenses, the myth of the glaive. Piece by piece, they transformed it from disaster into devotion. Today, it stands as proof that not every flop dies. Some grow stronger with time, cherished for the very flaws that once doomed them. If this strange, glittering fantasy still lives in your memory, drop a comment. Tell us what cult classic we should quest into next, because in the end, Krull didn't conquer the box office. It conquered memory, and sometimes, that's the greatest fantasy of all.